Section 3. The Chance of Recovery. Once upon a time, or conceivably even more than once, there was a man who went into a public house and asked for a glass of beer. I will not mention his name, for various and obvious reasons. It may be libel nowadays to say this about a man, or it may lay him open to police prosecution under the more humane laws of our day. So far as this first recorded action is concerned, his name may have been anything. William Shakespeare, or Geoffrey Chaucer, or Charles Dickens, or Henry Fielding, or any of those common names that crop up everywhere in the populace. The important thing about him is that he asked for a glass of beer. The still more important thing about him is that he drank it. And the most important thing of all is that he spat it out again, I regret to say, and threw the pewter mug at the publican, for the beer was abominably bad. True, he had not yet submitted it to any chemical analysis, but after he had drunk a little of it, he felt a very inward persuasion that there was something wrong about it. When he had been ill for a week, steadily getting worse all the time, he took some of the beer to the public analyst, and that learned man, after boiling it, freezing it, turning it green, blue, and yellow, and so on, told him that it did indeed contain a vast quantity of deadly poison. To continue drinking it, said the man of science thoughtfully, will undoubtedly be a course attended with risks, but life is inseparable from risk, and before you decide to abandon it, you must make up your mind what substitute you propose to put in your inside, in place of the beverage which at present more or less reposes there. If you will bring me a list of your selections in this difficult matter, I will willingly point out the various scientific objections that can be raised to all of them. The man went away, and became more and more ill, and indeed he noticed that nobody else seemed to be really well. As he passed the tavern, his eye chanced to fall upon various friends of his, writhing in agony on the ground, and indeed not a few of them lying dead and stiff in heaps about the road. To his simple mind this seemed a matter of some concern to the community, so he hurried to a police court and laid before a magistrate a complaint against the inn. It would indeed appear, said the justice of the peace, that the house you mention is one in which people are systematically murdered by means of poison. But before you demand so drastic a course as that of pulling it down or even shutting it up, you have to consider a problem of no little difficulty. Have you considered precisely what building you would put in its place, whether— At this point I regret to say that the man gave a loud scream and was forcibly removed from the court, announcing that he was going mad. Indeed, this conviction of his mental malady increased with his bodily malady, to such an extent that he consulted a distinguished doctor of psychology and psychoanalysis, who said to him confidentially, "As a matter of diagnosis, there can be no doubt that you are suffering from Binks aberration. But when we come to treatment, I may say frankly that it is very difficult to find anything to take the place of that affliction. Have you considered what is the alternative to madness?" Whereupon the man sprang up, waving his arms, and cried, "There is none. There is no alternative to madness. It is inevitable. It is universal. We must make the best of it." So, making the best of it, he killed the doctor, and then went back and killed the magistrate and the public analyst, and is now in an asylum, as happy as the day is long. In the fable appearing above, the case is propounded, which is primarily necessary to see at the start of a sketch of social renewal. It concerned a gentleman who was asked what he would substitute for the poison that had been put into his inside, or what constructive scheme he had to put in place of the den of assassins that had poisoned him. A similar demand is made of those of us who regard plutocracy as a poison, or the present plutocratic state as something like a den of thieves. In the parable of the poison it is possible that the reader may share some of the impatience of the hero. He will say that nobody would be such a fool as not to get rid of prussic acid or professional criminals, merely because there were differences of opinion about the course of action that would follow getting rid of them. But I would ask the reader to be a little more patient, not only with me but with himself, and ask himself why is it that we act with this promptitude in the case of poison and crime. It is not, even here, really because we are indifferent to the substitute. We should not regard one poison as an antidote to the other poison if it made the malady worse. We should not set a thief to catch a thief if it really increased the amount of thieving. The principle upon which we are acting, even if we are acting too quickly to think, or thinking too quickly to define, is nevertheless a principle that we could define. If we merely give a man an emetic after he has taken a poison, it is not because we think he can live on emetics any more than we think he can live on poisons. It is because we think that after he has first recovered from the poison, and then recovered from the emetic, there will come a time when he himself will think he would like a little ordinary food. That is the starting point of the whole speculation, so far as we are concerned. If certain impediments are removed, it is not so much a question of what we would do as of what he would do. So, if we save the lives of a number of people from the den of poisoners, we do not at that moment ask what they will do with their lives. We assume that they will do something a little more sensible than taking poison. In other words, the very simple first principle upon which all such reforms rest is that there is some tendency to recover in every living thing if we remove the pressure of an immediate peril or pain. Now, at the beginning of all this rough outline of a social reform, which I propose to trace here, I wish to make clear this general principle of recovery, without which it will be unintelligible. We believe that if things were released, they would recover. But we also believe, and this is very important in the practical question, that if things even begin to be released, they will begin to recover. If the man merely leaves off drinking the bad beer, his body will make some effort to recover its ordinary condition. If the man merely escapes from those who are slowly poisoning him to some extent, the very air he breathes will be an antidote to his poison. As I hope to explain in the essays that follow, I think the question of the real social reform divides itself into two distinct stages and even ideas. One is arresting a race towards mad monopoly that is already going on, reversing that revolution and returning to something that is more or less normal, but by no means ideal. The other is trying to inspire that more normal society with something that is in a real sense ideal, though not necessarily merely utopian. But the first thing to be understood is that any relief from the present pressure will probably have more moral effects than most of our critics imagine. Hitherto, all the triumphs have been triumphs of plutocratic monopoly. All the defeats have been defeats of private property. I venture to guess that one real defeat of a monopoly would have an instant and incalculable effect, far beyond itself, like the first defeats in the field of a military empire like Prussia parading itself as invincible. As each group or family finds again the real experience of private property, it will become a centre of influence, a mission. What we are dealing with is not a question of a general election to be counted by a calculating machine. It is a question of a popular movement that never depends on mere numbers. That is why we have so often taken merely as a working model the matter of a peasantry. The point about a peasantry is that it is not a machine, as practically every ideal social state is a machine, that is, a thing that will work only as it is set down to work in the pattern. You make laws for a utopia. It is only by keeping those laws that it can be kept a utopia. You do not make laws for a peasantry. You make a peasantry, and the peasants make the laws. I do not mean, as will be clear enough when I come to more detailed matters, that laws must not be used for the establishment of a peasantry, or even for the protection of it. But I mean that the character of a peasantry does not depend on laws. The character of a peasantry depends on peasants. Men have remained side by side for centuries in their separate and fairly equal farms without many of them losing their land, without any of them buying up the bulk of the land. Yet very often there was no law against their buying up the bulk of the land. Peasants could not buy because peasants would not sell. That is, this form of moderate equality, when once it exists, is not merely a legal formula, it is also a moral and psychological fact. People behave when they find themselves in that position as they do when they find themselves at home. That is, they stay there, or at least they behave normally there. There is nothing in abstract logic to prove that people cannot thus feel at home in a socialist utopia, but the socialists who describe utopias generally feel themselves in some dim way that people will not, and that is why they have to make their mere laws of economic control so elaborate and so clear. They use their army of officials to move men about like crowds of captives, from old quarters to new quarters, and doubtless to better quarters, but we believe that the slaves that we free will fight for us like soldiers. In other words, all that I ask in this preliminary note is that the reader should understand that we are trying to make something that will run of itself. A machine will not run of itself. A man will run of himself, even if he runs into a good many things that he would have been wiser to avoid. When freed from certain disadvantages, he can to some extent take over the responsibility. All schemes of collective concentration have in them the character of controlling the man even when he is free, if you will, of controlling him to keep him free. They have the idea that the man will not be poisoned if he has a doctor standing behind his chair at dinner time to check the mouthfuls and measure the wine. We have the idea that the man may need a doctor when he is poisoned, but no longer needs him when he is unpoisoned. We do not say, as they possibly do say, that he will always be perfectly happy or perfectly good because there are other elements in life besides the economic, and even the economic is affected by original sin. We do not say that because he does not need a doctor, he does not need a priest, or a wife, or a friend, or a god, or that his relations to these things can be ensured by any social scheme. But we do say that there is something which is much more real and much more reliable than any social scheme, and that is a society. There is such a thing as people finding a social life that suits them and enables them to get on reasonably well with each other. You do not have to wait till you have established that sort of society everywhere. It makes all the difference as soon as you have established it anywhere. So if I am told at the start, you do not think socialism or reformed capitalism will save England, do you really think distributism will save England? I answer, no. I think Englishmen will save England if they begin to have a chance. I am therefore in this sense hopeful. I believe that the breakdown has been a breakdown of machinery and not of men. And I fully agree, as I have just explained, that leaving work for a man is very different from leaving a plan for a machine. I ask the reader to realize this distinction at this stage of the description before I go on to describe more definitely some of the possible directions of reform. I am not at all ashamed of being ready to listen to reason. I am not at all afraid of leaving matters open to adjustment. I am not at all annoyed at the prospect of those who carry out these principles varying in many ways in their programs. I am much too much in earnest to treat my own programme as a party programme, or to pretend that my private bill must become an Act of Parliament, without any amendments. But I have a particular cause, in this particular case, for insisting in this chapter that there is a reasonable chance of escape, and for asking that the reasonable chance should be considered with reasonable cheerfulness. I do not care very much for that sort of American virtue which is now sometimes called optimism. It has too much of the flavour of Christian Science to be a comfortable thing for Christians, but I do feel, in the facts of this particular case, that there is a reason for warning people against the too hasty exhibition of pessimism and the pride of impotence. I do ask everybody to consider in a free and open fashion whether something of the sort here indicated cannot be carried out, even if it be carried out differently in detail, for it is a matter of the understanding of men. The position is much too serious for men to be anything but cheerful, and in this connection I would venture to utter a warning. A man has been led by a foolish guide, or a self-confident fellow traveller, to the brink of a precipice, which he might well have fallen over in the dark. It may well be said that there is nothing to be done but to sit down and wait for the light. Still, it might be well to pass the hours of darkness in some discussion about how it will be best for them to make their way backwards to more secure ground, and the recollection of any facts and the formulation of any coherent plan of travel will not be waste of time, especially if there is nothing else to do. But there is one piece of advice which we should be inclined to give to the guide who has misguided the simple stranger, especially if he is a really simple stranger, a man perhaps of rude education and elementary emotions. We should strongly advise him not to beguile the time by proving conclusively that it is impossible to go back, that there is no really secure ground behind, that there is no chance of finding the homeward path again, that the steps recently taken are irrevocable, and that progress must go forward and can never return. If he is a tactful man, in spite of his previous error, he will avoid this tone in conversation. If he is not a tactful man, it is not altogether impossible that before the end of the conversation somebody will go over the precipice after all, and it will not be the simple stranger. An army has marched across a wilderness, its column, in the military phrase, in the air, under a confident commander who is certain he will pick up new communications which will be far better than the old ones. When the soldiers are almost worn out with marching, and the rank and file of them have suffered horrible privations from hunger and exposure, they find they have only advanced unsupported into a hostile country, and that the signs of military occupation to be seen on every side are those of an enemy closing round. The march is suddenly halted, and the commander addresses his men. There are a great many things that he may say. Some may hold that he had much better say nothing at all. Many may hold that the less he says, the better. Others may urge, very truly, that courage is even more needed for a retreat than for an advance. He may be advised to rouse his disappointed men by threatening the enemy with a more dramatic disappointment, by declaring that they will best him yet, that they will dash out of the net even as it is thrown, and that their escape will be far more victorious than his victory. But anyhow, there is one kind of speech which the commander will not make to his men, unless he is much more of a fool than his original blunder proves him. He will not say, "We have now taken up a position which may appear to you very depressing, but I assure you it is nothing to the depression which you will certainly suffer as you make a series of inevitably futile attempts to improve it, or to fall back on what you may foolishly regard as a stronger position. I am very much amused at your absurd suggestion for getting back to our old communications, for I never thought much of your mangy old communications anyhow. There have been mutinies in the desert before now, and it is possible that the general will not be killed in battle with the enemy. A great nation and civilization has followed for 100 years or more a form of progress which held itself independent of certain old communications, in the form of ancient traditions about the land, the hearth, or the altar. It has advanced under leaders who were confident, not to say cocksure. They were quite sure that their economic rules were rigid, that their political theory was right, that their commerce was beneficent, that their parliaments were popular, that their press was enlightened, that their science was humane. In this confidence they committed their people to certain new and enormous experiments, to making their own independent nation an eternal debtor to a few rich men, to piling up private property in heaps on the faith of financiers, to covering their land with iron and stone and stripping it of grass and grain, to driving food out of their own country in the hope of buying it back again from the ends of the earth, to loading up their little island with iron and gold till it was weighted like a sinking ship, to letting the rich grow richer and fewer and the poor poorer and more numerous, to letting the whole world be cloven in two with a war of mere masters and mere servants, to losing every type of moderate prosperity and candid patriotism till there was no independence without luxury and no labour without ugliness, to leaving the millions of mankind dependent on indirect and distant discipline and indirect and distant sustenance, working themselves to death for they knew not whom, and taking their means of life from they knew not where, and all hanging on a thread of alien trade which grew thinner and thinner. To the people who have been brought into this position, many things may still be said. It will be right to remind them that mere wild revolt will make things worse and not better. It may be true to say that certain complexities must be tolerated for a time because they correspond to other complexities, and the two must be carefully simplified together. But if I may say one word to the princes and rulers of such a people, who have led them into such a pass, I would say to them as seriously as anything was ever said by man to man, for God's sake, for our sake, but above all for your own sake, do not be in this blind haste to tell them there is no way out of the trap into which your folly has led them, that there is no road except the road by which you have brought them to ruin, that there is no progress except the progress that has ended here. Do not be so eager to prove to your hapless victims that what is hapless is also hopeless. Do not be so anxious to convince them, now that you are at the end of your experiment, that you are also at the end of your resources. Do not be so very eloquent, so very elaborate, so very rational and radiantly convincing in proving that your own error is even more irrevocable and irremediable than it is. Do not try to minimize the industrial disease by showing it is an incurable disease. Do not brighten the dark problem of the coal pit by proving it is a bottomless pit. Do not tell the people there is no way but this, for many even now will not endure this. Do not say to men that this alone is possible, for many already think it impossible to bear. And at some later time, at some 11th hour, when the fates have grown darker and the ends have grown clearer, the mass of men may suddenly understand into what a blind alley your progress has led them. Then they may turn on you in the trap. And if they bore all else, they might not bear the final taunt that you can do nothing, that you will not even try to do anything. "What art thou, man, and why art thou despairing?" wrote the poet. "God shall forgive thee all but thy despair. Man also may forgive you for blundering, and may not forgive you for despairing."